Hello, everybody. Welcome to class. Today, we are going to be talking about the ethical and scientific guidelines for social work research. As social workers, we are deeply concerned with ethics. We have our own code of ethics. It is very much run by social justice and oriented towards individual agency and self-determination, um, as well as protecting those who are most vulnerable in society. So the way in which we do our research has to conform with that ethos. Very, very, very important stuff. So with that, we will dive in. So a lot of the different guidelines, ethical guidelines that we have now are as a result of people doing research without these ethical guidelines. And so, in response, we said, whoa, that's not so good. I think we need to come to a greater consensus around what makes for good ethical research. And in your book, I would encourage you to read the highly riveting account of Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments, where he had individuals come in and give shocks to people based on, who are the learners to see to what degree people would follow with obedience to authority. So it was a bit twisted, but it was also coming from a place of how could people do such bad things under the Nazi regime. And so, kind of he had these, this ethical dilemma, tried to figure out how do we recreate it in a way that's safe and in a laboratory. And so, there was a lot of stuff that came out of that, or even not only in terms of his research, but in terms of how he did his research and the ethics of that. So when we do research, especially as we do research on people, now we also do research on animals, we also do research on intangible things. But especially when it comes to research on people, there are certain things that we can do, certain things we cannot do. And there's a lot of gray space in the middle. So one must always think then about the research from the standpoint of the person who would be the subject or the person experiencing about whom the data is being taken. Um, and so we need to really kind of put ourselves in their shoes to see, how well is it going to be appropriate. So just because you have an ethical code does not necessarily mean that you are going to be engaging in ethical practice. It could be a very warped ethical code, as we know from the Nazi experiments, as well as then the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. Um, so the Tuskegee one was injecting African Americans who were rural and generally lacked education with syphilis and seeing what came up with it. So they were intentionally sterilizing people and giving them syphilis to find out what happened. They were given, this unbeknownst to them. And so it wasn't, it was highly, highly unethical. Um, and so through some of these big cases, we then have the creation of the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. So this is a national commission which then helps to prevent unethical behavior. So it comes out of also something called the Belmont Report, where we want to have respect for persons, such as treating people as autonomous agents. So it's kind of getting at that issue of dignity and self-determination, and protecting them who have diminished autonomy. So uh, people who are prisoners, young children, people with cognitive disabilities, they conceivably have less autonomy, and they are thereby more vulnerable. So we need to have respect for them. Beneficence is this idea of minimizing the harm and maximizing the amount of benefit that a person would receive from this. And then this idea of justice. So where, we distribute the benefits and the risks of the research fairly. And not just deprive some people of stuff and then give all of the good stuff to other people and then see what happens. So we have then, more federal policies that have been, developed as a result of this. One of which is the designation of an institutional review board within every university. And so this board at our university will then apply the ethical standards that are set by federal regulation. And then they can even have even more stringent standards. But basically, anybody who's doing research has to have the approval of the institutional board that says, yes, okay, you are doing this in an ethical manner. Uh, and so part of that process, and this isn't, I don't think this is in your book, but you have to then take a training run by, generally, it's usually run by the CITI program, but I suppose there are other programs. CITI is an acronym that stands for Collaborative Institutional Training Initiative. And so basically you take these trainings, you get certificates on different types of research ethics and so that way you know what you're talking about, and then you have to provide those certificates to the IRB saying that, yes, I have been trained within the past couple of years. I've received all of that training and I know how to do this. And so now I'm ready to submit my application for my research to the board. Yeah. And so, we have not just those federal guidelines, but we've got these ethical principles within the social work profession. And so we've got this double and as well as overlapping, code of ethics where we need to protect research participants. We have to have honesty and openness in the way in which we do our research. We also always want to go for valid results and not just kind of, warp the results and be swayed maybe by money. And we also want to be open about how is this research going to be used? Who's going to benefit from it? Will it be disseminated to everybody, or is it just going to be kept by lock and key? Okay, so these are really important things. And particularly around this idea of use of research, many researchers have gone, say, to certain populations, Native populations and African American populations, people who have been marginalized by society. They take lots of data and then they publish it for themselves, but the results never come back to the people. And so, this conceivably is unethical. That it's not coming back to benefit people about whom the research was conducted. So, um, as we want to then protect research participants, we want to avoid harming them. And there can be simply, different definitions of harm. We want to, we want to get their informed consent. So they need to understand and agree to what to participate on their own without being coerced. And we also need to make sure that if we're gathering sensitive data, that we're maintaining their privacy and that it's going to be kept, confidential. And, we're not going to have data breaches or just leaving it around. Because, sometimes different types of research. If there isn't enough research and you've got too many descriptors, then, especially in, say, a small town or in a zip code, you can actually put two and three and four together and determine, oh, I know who this person is. And so, that can be a breach of confidentiality. So we need to be able to maintain that sense of privacy for people. So when we talk then about harming participants, does it mean that subjects should not be harmed psychologically as well as physically? So there's kind of different forms of harm that can take place. That they should feel no anxiety or distress whatsoever during a study or only after their involvement ends. This is a lot of gray area. And so, for instance, if we're studying anxiety, we can't measure something if people aren't anxious. So if it's reasonable, then do we give them therapy and resources afterwards? So, we need to really be thinking about this and how we go about it. Uh, and then we talked about this idea of informed consent. So this, kind of gives to the that the individual is not going to be subject to the research without their full knowledge and willingness to participate. So we can't make people do research. Now, a lot of times with children, then we have to go to their parents and say, parent, are you willing to have your child do this research on, are you willing to give that permission? So, this consent has to be written at a linguistic level of the participants. Um, so they have to be able to read it and understand it. We have to be honest about the research motivations. Or if we're doing something that's sneaky, there's got to be a really good justification for why we're not telling the participant about this. Uh, and so, we got to be open about our affiliations, the risks, the benefits, what they'll get out of it. We got to be clear on the confidentiality and give participants a choice, whether or not that they want to participate without consequence. We can't say, all right, I'm going to, subjecting students to a study. You can't say, oh, well, you have to do this in order to get a good grade in the class. Okay, that's a consequence, and so that's not a permissible approach. Uh, so we want to maintain privacy and confidentiality. So, sometimes you might need to get a certificate. If there's healthcare related content, then there's, HIPAA. The Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act has a whole set of standards of how people's medical information can be shared and when it can and when it cannot, to whom it might be shared. So there's a lot of confidentiality there. And, with this honesty and openness. So it's important that we are open about how we went about the research study, where it's important that we share our findings, whether they were as we had anticipated or not. So we got to be, open about what is the truth. And so we need to allow others then to critique our message, our methods, and we do that not just saying by saying, well, this is what I found and it's true, but we have to allow others, to critique that. And so we do that through the peer review process. So everything needs to be published honestly. When it's unhonest or dishonest and we publish fraudulent results, especially when people have big careers that they are building off of, research findings, and they become really well known, and then maybe they start manipulating the data. Then their whole career can come crumbling down because what they've been putting out there wasn't true. So we absolutely have to be honest in this. And when you've got a conflict of interest, you need to be clear about that. And so conflict of interest, conflict of commitment, even. So this is where maybe you've got a financial or some other kind of stake in that can bias your findings. Now, it doesn't mean that you cannot do the research, but you've got to be very, very clear and open with the audience to let them know, say, hey, I've got this relationship. So, for example, I published research on money habitudes and how well the cards work. And so I needed to be very clear and open with everybody when I do presentations, as well as when I use it with my class. Also with when I published the paper, that I've received money from money habitudes. Now, I used the tool and I get it for free. I have, created a training design. So I have been helping the company. And so I want, good things for this company. They gave me some money so that way I could then travel and present the findings. So I'd had to be very open about that because, this has the possibility to bias my findings. However, I did decline pay for the research itself. So, but my partner, she got a course buyout, which meant that her university received some money so that she could do some research and on this money habitude scale. So, we got to be very clear and open of, who's been paying us. Are we doing research on sugar that's been sponsored by the Sugar Council? In which case, then how unbiased, are we going to be? And is this actually going to show us good results, and or do we need to be very skeptical as we're reading these results? This is all really important information. And so we need to then really be always aiming to seek truth. Um, Now, how do we get at truth? There's a lot of different ways. And, Milgram used a lab so that way he could kind of distill and have a very controlled experiment. But Baumrind, said, the lab, that's not an appropriate context for all of this obedience studies because the Nazis didn't use a lab per se. They just, told people, do this, be obedient or we'll shoot you. So, the conditions in Milgram's were fabricated. So Baumrind was saying that, well, the findings then aren't realistic, whereas Milgram said that they were. So what basically we need to do is look for answers, not necessarily agreement, because, at the end of the day, we may not be able to agree. Uh, I mentioned earlier the internal institutional review board. And so this kind of determines to what extent do you need to have, kind of official review of your research? To what extent are you going to be using people and having their sensitive data? To what extent are they be harmed or will they benefit? So you can be exempt from a review if there's, minimal involvement or maybe that the data has already been gathered. And so there's a low risk to any harm coming to people because maybe you don't even know who those people are and the information has already been blinded. Or, you might have an expedited review. So, minimal human subject involvement, but, you have some informed consent. So maybe a survey or something like that, as opposed to then a full committee review where maybe you're doing experiments on people or you've got a population that is a high risk, such as some minority groups or children or prisoners or people like that. So there can be different levels, and so you need to disclose what it is that you're going to be doing, what the experiments are going to entail, how you're going to measure everything, justify why it's needed, what is it that you hope to gain from it, what are your hypotheses. All of these kinds of things have to be then submitted to the university institutional review board, have them approve it, and then you can get studied. You can't just, get started tomorrow. It's a very long process potentially, but it's also a very systematic process. Now, when we do internet research, this is a way of connecting with people and getting information that otherwise could be very difficult to get. So, we need to also then determine what is public and what's private. People putting stuff on chat boards, are they assuming that other people are going to be lurking and reading their stuff, or do they feel like, yeah, I'm putting it all out there for the world to see? So there's, confidentiality concerns and how do we measure emotional harm? Oh, and so, people may say that, they're giving, informed consent, but maybe they're just answering questions. How do we verify who they truly are? So there's a lot of issues here that need to be explored and used. So all of this then boils down to several guidelines that we have for social work research. One is to test these ideas against the empirical reality without being too invested in a specific result. We want to be open to find what the truth shows us. We don't want to be swayed by emotion or popularity or by who's paying us to find certain results, based on what they want to see. So, we want to go what's going to be actually the truth, what is going to be the best for, for what we're finding. We want to be systematic. Otherwise, there's going to be too many other factors that are thrown in there, and we won't be able to verify that the results are actually real. So we've got to be organized. We've got to be systematic in that work. Next, we want, and part of that systematization is to document everything, disclose everything that's relevant, disclose we're receiving money and what our biases might be, disclosing who we are in terms of our own racial and intersectionality identities. And how that may impact our understanding and even our research questions. So we need to disclose that. We want to be able to clarify the assumptions and specify the meanings and how we're interpreting everything and what we mean by that. So thereby how we're measuring it. And then we want to, have a skeptical stance towards current knowledge. We don't know everything. And so this is it requires a degree of humility to find out what we think we know. There's narratives that are out in society, such as, for what I study, that this idea that being financially independent is a good goal. Well, not everybody can achieve that. And is it actually the goal that we want? A lot of the financial education is oriented around getting people to be financially independent. And yet, that's not necessarily the reality of how many families operate. So, we got to have a real healthy degree of skepticism. And that can then open up, and show us the broader reality that we're trying to understand. Then we also need to provide enough documentation that others can replicate our research and say that, yeah, okay, this actually holds water and it works with these different populations. And from there, we start building understandings of how society is, and we build these social theories. And so, we look for some of these patterns and regularities in what it is that we do. So with all of that, that is some of the ethical guidelines for engaging in social work research. Thank you very much, and I will see you in the next video.